Hello, my name is Michael Gant. This is GNSC 239, and this is my presentation on Yellowstone wolves and stream ecology. River dynamics in relation to wolf populations, a delicate balance. Gray wolves were extirpated from Yellowstone in the early 1920s, resulting in an explosion in elk populations and increased herbivory in riparian areas. Elk previously avoided these areas as they were easily seen and hunted by wolf packs, but now had free rein without fear of predation. Riparian vegetation was heavily degraded and in turn caused stream health to sharply decline. Streams began to migrate faster, forming shallower and wider channels indicative of an unhealthy stream. A question was raised that if the removal of an apex predator such as wolves could cause a cascade of changes that even affected the streams, could this be reversed? To the right, I just have a image showing a healthy versus unhealthy stream. With a healthy stream, you typically have a narrow channel with deep water, as well as stable banks with vegetation that reaches close to the water, where below you see an unhealthy stream where you have a wide channel with shallower water and eroded riverbanks. Stream characteristics. The channel is the main path of water flow, shaped by stream flow, sediment load, as well as vegetation in and around the river. The bank are the sides of the channel where flow is contained, and the bank fold channel is the point of flow where bank limit is reached and water begins to fill the floodplain. The floodplain is a relatively flat area adjacent to a stream that is prone to flooding after storms or periods of high water. The floodplain reduces severity of floods if properly formed. As mentioned previously, riparian vegetation are plant communities that can influence bank stability, moderate microclimates and water temperatures, cycle nutrients, as well as produce organic carbon that is an essential component of food webs for many terrestrial and aquatic organisms, as well as others. Rosgen stream classification. The Rosgen stream classification system categorizes streams based on their channel morphology, as well as taking into account their appearance, sediment makeup, and sediment relationships. By classifying streams into distinct types of AA through G, we can better predict the future behavior of a stream, as well as how it will endure high water volume events. As you can see on the figure on the right, a healthy stream, which would be an AA+, is both narrow, relatively straight, and has a deep channel, whereas an unhealthy stream, say an F stream, meanders back and forth and is both narrow as well as having a shallow channel. This is important as if you look at the cross section of a healthy stream versus an unhealthy stream, you'll notice that the flood prone area is much lower in a healthy stream, whereas the banks of an unhealthy stream have been eroded to a point where they can flood much more easily. A history of wolves in Yellowstone. In the early 20th century, wolves were a large threat to livestock for the ranchers and farmers living around the Yellowstone area. Farmers and ranchers campaigned, and government intervention eradicated wolf populations in Yellowstone, the last of which in 1926. Wolves kept elk populations in check and away from flatter areas with streams. Without these wolves, elk were free to roam wherever they pleased. Many began to move to lower elevations and began to feast on riparian vegetation, which they'd previously avoided. After wolf extirpation, you began to see booming elk populations. Before wolf extirpation, elk preferred higher elevations, less open habitat, more burned forests, and in areas of high wolf density, steeper slopes. Without the threat of wolves, elk could go lower in elevation to the streams without the worry of predation. An elk population of 1,600 individuals was estimated in 1920 in the study area, a number which grew to potentially 2,500 after wolf extirpation. Due to overgrazing with no threat from predators, elk populations eventually began to starve and slowly declined to an estimated population of 1,000 individuals in the 1990s. This was unexpected, as researchers believed that elk would eventually stabilize somewhere around their previous population. The studied area was the Upper Gallatin Basin within Yellowstone National Park. Floodplain Reach A, at the bottom of the image, was used as a control reach as it's upstream of the farthest elk range and out of their territory. Floodplain Reach B was lower elevation and in a typical grazing ground for the elk community. Floodplain Reach C was the lowest elevation grazing ground, and you can see on the image on the right, the darker shaded area shows the max range and the highest elevation that elk will travel. Methods. There were many methods used, including historical photographs, both ground and aerial, which were obtained of all three reaches since the mid-1920s, as well as annual peak discharge of each year, which was recorded, with missing years estimated through regression analysis. Regression analysis can be thought of as taking the average of a dependent variable while accounting for many independent variables. You can see on the top right they use both USGS data as well as data from the studied reaches to form these missing years. They also used an above and below design, with untreated control reach A as the above, which was upstream, where elk foraging did not occur. Control reach B and C, which were both downstream, the below, featured heavy elk foraging. 4 transects were set up on each reach with a spacing of 200 meters between cross sections. The figure on the bottom right would show what would be one of these transects out of the 4 for each reach. You can see each transect line going across the cross section, which would allow researchers to form an idea of the actual water flow for that transect. As a quick side note, these transect lines allowed researchers to find the area of each cross sections in a similar way to integration in calculus. Each orange line can be thought of as a small transect line area, where by taking each small transect line area, you can add them all up to find the total area under the curve, or in this case, above. Methods continued. T-tests were used to investigate for potential differences in width and depth ratios of treatment reaches B and C versus the control reach A. Bankfold discharge was found for each measured cross-section by establishing a power function between hydraulic radius and Manning's N measurement for each reach. Using a previous study, Perrett and Johnson, an established relationship between peak discharge and return period allowed researchers to find a discharge frequency for each reach. Finally, a return period could be estimated for the calculated bankfold discharge of each cross-section mentioned. An annual peak discharge from 1890 to 2003 for the Gallatin River at Gateway is pictured above, based on gauge data over a 91-year period and estimates derived from regression analysis mentioned previously. These 4 images show a photo sequence of the Gallatin River and the floodplain surrounding it, showing the status of riparian willow communities along Reach B. While it's hard to see the stream in photos A and B, you can get a mental image from photos C and D where the stream begins to show. In photo A, which was in the summer of 1924, midway through wolf extirpation, you can see a lot of riparian vegetation that totally covers up the river from view. In photo B, summer of 1949, more than 20 years after the last wolf was removed from Yellowstone, heavy foraging pressure is seen and a distinct lack of vegetation along the river. Photo C is in the late spring of 1969. Lack of riparian vegetation has begun to cause the stream to meander, and you can see almost a total lack of vegetation. Photo D is the midsummer of 2003, a bit more than a decade after wolves were reintroduced. Notice the large increase in riparian vegetation as well as healthier trees. There are many such examples of vegetation being totally removed from parts of the park. This is partly due to elk being such a large animal and requiring so much food, as well as the large packs that move together foraging the same spot for days and even weeks. On the top left, you can see a photo before wolf extirpation, where patches of willows and other plant species were commonly seen around the park. On the bottom right, almost a century after wolf extirpation, many of these plant patches had been picked clean, lowering diversity and decreasing habitat space for other species relying on them for food, as well as protection from predators. Another example of overgrazing from elk populations can be seen here. The streams and rivers of Yellowstone, after decades of overgrazing, could be classified as E and F streams in the Roskin stream classification system. Bank erosion was common due to the almost complete lack of riparian vegetation. But more than 20 years after wolf reintroduction, willows and other plants were able to reestablish themselves along riverbanks. They could now stabilize banks and prevent erosion, as well as provide shade and nutrients for the streams. Wolf reintroduction. Wolves were brought back to Yellowstone in the mid-1990s throughout 1995 and 1996. They were restored as an apex predator. Within the next decade, riparian vegetation began to return without the constant overgrazing of large elk populations. A trophic cascade effect was seen, of predator to prey to the food webs used by the prey. Riparian vegetation, primarily willows, cottonwoods, and shrubbery, all have recovered and become increasingly widespread. In the two images on the right, you can see a great example of this, where the spring of 1996, the year of wolf reintroduction, you see a wide, fast channel that probably is not as deep as the one on the right, which is much narrower and features plenty of riparian vegetation. Results and conclusions. Vegetation measurements conducted in 2004 revealed significant decreases in willow coverage of Reach B, 26% coverage, and Reach C, 5% coverage, when compared to Reach A, which remained at 85% coverage. Note: elk did not forage Reach A. While Reach C did not see as much change in bankfull discharge, Reach B went through significant erosion and channel widening since wolf extirpation. As riparian vegetation was consumed, more sediment fell from the banks and entered the river, furthering erosion. This may explain the widening in Channel B. A healthier ecosystem for all trophic levels. After wolf reintroduction, elk populations restabilized and returned to normal population levels. Because of this, plants recovered, mainly in the lower elevation areas of the park. In some areas, vegetation increased over 1,500%. The resurgence of willow communities along riverbanks have allowed beaver populations to flourish, from one community in the study area in 1995 to 9 today in 2005. Elk killed by wolves are rarely completely eaten, providing a constant source of food for predators such as birds of prey, mustelids, and bears. And of course, healthier rivers and streams, allowing species of birds and fish to flourish. I believe I should mention that wolf reintroduction is not without controversy. Farmers and ranchers are rightfully concerned. Their livelihood is impacted from wolves attacking their livestock. Hunters are also impacted and feel economic stress from wolf reintroduction taking potential elk kills. Some scientists have claimed it is too late to reintroduce wolves to Yellowstone and that their period of absence has gone on for too long. Wolves are also partly misunderstood due to movies and folklore demonizing them as cold-blooded killers. I personally believe that despite some of the controversy, wolf reintroduction has been nothing but a success. Thank you for listening. Here are my sources. Have a nice day.